to sing and worship with the community here as well. So it was an honor to be asked to share with you. And what I'm going to talk about is artificial intelligence and the biblical story, thoughts from a Christian computer scientist. And of course, as you can imagine, in computer science, this has been a profound development that has made big changes in our curriculum. We have professors at Calvin that teach machine learning and artificial intelligence, but we seek to do that in a way that's also informed by our Christian commitments. And so the question comes up, what does faith have to do with AI? And so I hope to talk a bit about that with you today, and I hope to leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So I thought I would start off by going to ChatGPT, which is an AI engine that you can access on the World Wide Web, and I asked it, write a poem about LaGrave Avenue Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the style of Dr. Seuss. And this is what it came up with. On LaGrave Avenue, sturdy and true, a church lifts its spires to skies ever blue. Its stones tell a story both steady and long, a house filled with prayer, with scripture, with song. The sunlight shines bright through the glass-colored fair, casting warm rainbows on people in prayer. The organ resounds, the voices all blend together in worship of God without end. From Sunday to Sunday, its doors open wide, welcoming neighbors to gather inside. For here in this place, God's love is made known at LaGrave, where his people are never alone. It's not bad, eh? I mean, this is a machine-generated poem. So how does it do this? Well, if you search the internet or the web, you'll find there's lots of information about LaGrave Christian Reformed Church, which the AI system has vacuumed up and learned about. And of course, you can find all kinds of primary, secondary, and other sources about Dr. Seuss. And somehow this machine has mashed up this information and produced this little poem. So basically what a large language model does, which is what ChatGPT is, it's a kind of AI system. It starts by collecting an enormous amount of data. Then it trains a model based on that data to be unsurprised by that data, basically so that it's unsurprised about the kinds of words that you find in a particular context. And then there's a third stage where you do a bunch of tweaking, and that's necessary because a lot of the data that you'll pull in from the internet or from the World Wide Web is of questionable moral kind of content and so on, so you need to tamp down some of the less desirable content. And so that's basically the steps. And modern computing has given us the ability, modern supercomputers, to be able to work with very, very large amounts of data. And the World Wide Web and the internet and large storage systems have given us more data than we've ever had before. And that has, in a nutshell, made AI possible. Now, some have gone so far because quite frankly, the results are quite remarkable. I know people who even research AI that were surprised at how well ChatGPT worked. There's people like Mark Andreessen, who is actually a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. He was one of the early pioneers of the World Wide Web. He actually wrote the very first graphical World Wide Web browser. I don't know if anyone here knows what that was. This was back in the last century. Mosaic, you ever heard of Mosaic, the predecessor to Netscape Navigator? Anyways, he knows about tech, and he wrote an article called AI Will Save the World, in which he says, every child will have a personal tutor and mentor, every scientist will have their own personalized AI assistant, productivity will accelerate, the creative arts will flower, AI will help to cure all diseases, it will end wars, it will help us to get interstellar travel, AI will make the world, quote, a warmer and nicer place. These are very bold predictions, almost religious in nature. AI will wipe away every tear. This echoes the sentiment of Neil Postman, who was writing decades ago, actually, where he said, "We believe nothing, if not that history is moving towards some preordained paradise, and that technology is the force behind that movement." And AI, of course, is the latest version of that. And in fact, you don't have to look far to read about how AI is religious. Folks in Silicon Valley, their vision for AI is a kind of religion repackaged, a trust in technology to solve all of our problems, old and new. And it has at its basis a kind of religious orientation. I caught a piece of the sermon this morning, in essence, it's idolatry. Whenever you replace, the creator with something in creation, you've built an idol out of it, right? And John Calvin said, right, our hearts are perpetual factories of idols, and technology, of course, is one of the idols of our time. And this is not new. You don't have to go very far in the biblical story to read about things like the Tower of Babel, right, where people use the technology of the day, bricks and mortar, to build their own tower, their own bridge between heaven and earth. Something, of course, that only Jesus Christ can provide. And they did it as well to make a name for themselves. And so we see right from the beginning people seeking autonomy, doing things by their own wits. And so this story is, in a way, nothing new. Of course, that's not the only story in town. There are those who actually believe that technology one day will destroy us, right? This is the Frankenstein narrative, right? That we build technology and eventually it turns on us and it destroys us. This is the sort of fodder of a lot of a lot of science fiction movies. But you'll also find people, in technology writing and warning us that there could be very dire consequences. A recent book has the title, "If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies: Why Superhuman AI Would Kill Us All." The godfather of AI, one of the folks who helped develop the modern structure of neural networks, just a while back, said that there's probably about a 20 or 30% chance that we will be destroyed by AI. That was Gregory Hinton. And of course, you don't have to look far to find books with titles like, 50 Ways AI Will End the World, The Artificial Apocalypse, Our Final Invention. In a lot of ways, these predictions remind me of the Walt Disney film Fantasia, right? Here you have Mickey Mouse, right, kind of acting as a sorcerer's apprentice. He gets, he looks for a shortcut, to help with his chores, and he casts a spell in order to recruit these brooms to do his work for him. And they multiply out of control and fill the whole room with water, if you recall the film. And I think in some ways, magic and technology are very similar, right? They're sort of our own efforts to try and impose our will on the natural world. And sometimes when we use magic or technology in ways that we don't quite understand, technologies that are very powerful, there can be profound consequences. And so I think some of these warnings are not completely things that we ought to ignore. There are some that go even further. So Paul Kingsnorth, who's a journalist and writer from the UK, wrote an article just a little while ago titled "AI Demonic: A Spiritual Exploration of AI." And in that, Kingsnorth writes, here's an excerpt. "Whatever is happening, it seems obvious to me that something indeed is being ushered in. Through our efforts and our absent-minded passions, something is crawling towards the throne. The great mind is being built. Something is coming." So he has a more pessimistic view of this, right? That AI perhaps is summoning some dark, evil forces that are going to turn on us, and we will be in trouble. So the question then comes, what is AI? Is it the savior, or is it the villain? Is it going to save the world, or is it going to destroy us all? And I think it's really helpful, to turn to the biblical story, as we will in a moment. And I found these words from Al Walters, who wrote the book Creation Regained, very, very helpful. Walters writes, "The Bible is unique in its uncompromising rejection of all attempts to identify a part of creation as either the villain or the savior." I think in both of these views, we tend to elevate an aspect of creation as either the savior or we see it as the source of evil, and we need to be careful about that. And so the question comes, how ought we to think about this? I like this quote by Alistair MacIntyre, a philosopher of ethics, who once wrote, "We cannot answer the question, what ought I to do, unless we answer the prior question of what story am I a part?" Now, as I mentioned briefly, Silicon Valley has a kind of story, a kind of worldview that animates the work that happens there. There's also the other story that we find in sci-fi sort of novels and movies of technology, a pessimistic view of the world. But what about the biblical story? How might the biblical story, which was actually written in the Bronze and Iron Age, have anything to say about the age of AI? We can't really go into a Bible concordance or dictionary and find passages about computers or AI. I mean, how in the world can we actually turn to the scriptures for this? Although Psalm 81 has some reference to God left us to our own devices, but that's not what that's talking about. So I think the way forward is to think about the grand biblical story, the biblical narrative from creation to new creation, which can be summarized with the basic themes of creation, fall, redemption, new creation. This story forms a worldview that answers questions like, who are we? What's wrong with the world? What's the remedy? Where are we going? These big questions can situate our cultural work and technology in the proper place, I think. So what I'm going to do briefly, our time is limited, but let's march through these biblical themes, the biblical narrative, creation, fall, redemption, new creation, and let's look at them in terms of their implications for AI, just briefly. So the creation story, what does it have to say about AI? Well, I would argue that AI is part of the latent potential in creation. So I think sometimes when we think about creation, we limit that to birds and bees and stars and flowers and fish and that kind of stuff. And to be sure, that's part of the wonderful creation that God made. But God also is creator of all of the things he has ordained to be, the potentials in creation, the latent potentials, right? Adam and Eve may have been standing on ground that includes sand, right? Which is silicon dioxide, which has silicon in it, which is the building blocks of modern computers. That wasn't a surprise to God that we would be able to unfold these things and discover these things. AI is part of the possibilities in creation, so it's part of God's creation. The cultural mandate already in the first chapter of Genesis tells us that we have a responsibility. Right? God has given us a responsibility to fill the earth, and that's not only filling with kids, it's filling with all of the possibilities, unfolding all of those possibilities. The first chapter of Genesis already tells us we're made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, which means that we're distinct from other parts of creation. We share some of the same stuff. Of course, we're made of the dust of the earth. We're made of the same things as other plants and animals, but we're also made in the image of God. There's another aspect to us. We are different than machines. We're distinct from machines. And then I think another thing we can argue is that created reality is not reducible to data. The way the creation is described in the opening books the opening book of Genesis is, all this wonderful, comprehensive diversity of things that God calls into being. None of it is built on top of data, right? Dataism is actually a kind of modern ideology in machine learning and AI. It's an ideology that sees everything as nothing but data, which is something we have to watch out for. When you're a data scientist, everything looks like data, right? When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we have to just be careful not to reduce creation into just data. One author wrote it this way, describing dataism. He says, it's this ideology that giraffes, tomatoes, and people are just the same thing, but they're different ways of processing data. It's a very reductionistic view. So, of course, somewhere near the beginning, the human family fell into sin, and that has had implications for all of creation. Right? We have the thorns and thistles that infect our work, and I can assure you that's the same in computing. The whole creation is groaning, we're told in Revelations 8, verse 22. It's comprehensive. Sin is like a virus that attaches itself to all parts of creation, and that infects our cultural work. Our technology is also infected by sin. And so one of the things we need to do is to be able to distinguish between God's good creation and also the distortions due to the fall. And so that becomes one of our challenges. Sometimes people ask me, is AI good or evil? And I say, well, that's a bit of a false dichotomy. AI is part of the latent potential in creation. The question is, how is it being directed, right? Is it being tainted by sin and misdirected, or are we unfolding it like we were told to in Genesis 1, verse 28, in ways that honor God, show love for our neighbor? And of course, in the fullness of time, Jesus Christ came, right? This is the center of the biblical story. I love the verse, the chapter Colossians 1, right, which is this comprehensive poem almost to the supremacy of Christ, right? For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And likewise in 2 Corinthians, all of this is from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself. This is a comprehensive sort of view of redemption, this idea of all things. My theology colleagues tell me the word for all things in Colossian is tapanta, which literally means everything. It's comprehensive. And he calls us to participate in that work, right? He gave us a ministry of reconciliation. He committed to us a message of reconciliation. One of Calvin's taglines is that we're called to be agents of renewal. I think a more biblical phrase is, agents of reconciliation. But this idea of being an agent, a messenger of reconciliation in all parts of the world. Salvation is absolutely personal, but it's also more comprehensive. Jesus is on a cosmic salvage operation. In the words of the late Calvin College professor Gordon Spikeman, nothing matters but the kingdom. But because of the kingdom, everything matters, right? It's this big, big view of salvation. So if AI is part of creation and we're called to be an agent of reconciliation in all things, why would that not also include the world of technology and artificial intelligence? Well, I can't go into too much details. You'd have to enroll at Calvin again and take computer science, and you could learn all of these things. But in a shorthand, at Calvin University and at places like Dordt University and others, we use a set of design norms to help us think more broadly about our work in technology. One of the problems in AI and engineering is the development of a kind of tunnel vision. And we need to think more broadly about God's creation and about the norms for creation. And these list of norms come from biblical principles, Christian philosophy, which we use and call the design norms at Calvin. And all of our students learn about these in engineering and computer science. And just very briefly, these are things like cultural appropriateness, right? Being able to preserve what's good in a culture without preserving what's good in a cultural context, thinking about the context for a technology. Transparency has to do with telling the truth, being open, not bearing false witness. The social norm has to do with encouraging community and hospitality and conviviality. Stewardship is a basic, biblical norm, caring for the earth. Delightful harmony has to do with the aesthetic aspects in creation, right? Making sure that we build things that are not only just useful, but pleasing to use. Justice, right, is a fundamental biblical norm, being able to promote fairness. And AI, there are real issues with bias and so on that we need to be attentive to. Caring, right, is the response to care for our neighbor, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And trust has to do with, not putting our ultimate trust in technology, but also building technology that's reliable, that people can count on, especially if human life and limb depend on these sorts of things like airplanes and air traffic control systems and life support systems. So these norms sort of provide a bigger context, they're a bigger view of God's creation that are informed by Christian worldview and Christian thinking and help us to be an agent of reconciliation in the area of AI. All right, very quickly, because time is flying, but the biblical story begins with a garden, but then it ends with a city. Right? The biblical story moves from a garden to a city, a garden city, if you will. There's rivers and trees in it as well. And it's one in which Christ makes all things new. And the New Jerusalem's builder and architect is God, we're told, right? And I think that's really important. I think sometimes as Christian engineers, we can somehow fall into the trap of thinking that we can somehow help God usher in his kingdom through our technology. And we have to be a little bit careful about that. We need to reject, rival stories to the biblical stories that say that somehow we will be able to usher in our own heaven and earth without God, the sort of Silicon Valley story. We need to be careful. God does not subcontract the New Jerusalem to us, right? We're called to be faithful. We're called to be signposts of that New Jerusalem. We're called to In the words of Lewis Smedes, make some imperfect models of the perfect world to come. That's what we're called to do. But there's this really curious verse in Revelations 21, verse 24, this idea of the glory and honor of the nations being brought into the New Jerusalem, right? The kings of the earth bringing their splendor into it. And I find that really interesting. There may be some artifacts from our world, from history, that find their way into the new heavens and the new earth, purified by sin, of course, but they'll be there. Richard Mao wrote a little interesting book about this called When the Kings Come Marching In, right? And he talks about Isaiah 60, right? How it talks about lumber and herds, all of these things being brought into Zion. He talks about the ships of Tarshish, these pagan symbols of commercial power are there in Zion, right? Repurposed for God's glory. So I sometimes ask my students, will there be computers in heaven? And they say, no. I said, will there be harps in heaven? Oh yeah, there'll be harps in heaven. Well, harps are also human cultural artifacts, right? And if computing was part of the latent potential in God's good creation, which he is restoring and redeeming, why wouldn't it be there in the new heavens and the new earth? It's all speculative. No eye has seen or ear has heard, of course, what's in store for us, but I like to think it'll be there. And it won't be running Windows, I'm pretty sure, but we'll have to wait and see. All right, one important concept is the notion of structure and direction. This comes from the book Creation Regained again. And the idea here is that we need to distinguish between the structure of creation and the direction of creation, right? So what is God's good creation that persists after the fall, and then the harmful distortions, perversions due to the fall. And here's an example. I find this interesting. Genesis 2, verse 12 has this one little verse in parentheses even that just says, the gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin, which is sometimes interpreted as pearls, and onyx are also there. So why was this verse dropped into the creation story, right? This idea that there's gold there. Well, I think it's because God intended for us to uncover the latent potentials of irons and minerals and all the things that they can do. Those are good things. In fact, we see gold being referenced throughout the scriptures, but we see that it can be directed towards idolatry, right? The golden calf, Nebuchadnezzar's idol, right? Gold being used for put in service of idols and of sin. But we also see places where gold is actually put in service of God, right? So Exodus 31, Bezalel and Oholiab are mentioned. In fact, one of the first mentions of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament is actually in Ezekiel 31. Besides the opening of Genesis where the Spirit is hovering over the waters, there's this mention of how the Holy Spirit gave them the ability to work with these arts and crafts and these materials and to teach others. And so here we see gold being put into service of God, building his temple and the ark and his kingdom. And in fact, if you fast forward to the second last chapter of the Bible, gold is mentioned as one of the building blocks of the New Jerusalem. And so we see these materials, right, which are part of God's good creation being put in service of idolatry or being put in service to God and his kingdom. And I think AI is the same thing, that latent in the creation there is this possibility for computing and for algorithms and for AI. It can be put into service of idols or it can be put in service of God and to show love and care for our neighbors. So here's some examples of some of the good ways that AI is being directed, right? Being directed towards shalom, right? AI for predicting earthquake aftershocks, AI for precision medicine, how AI can be used to save species at risk like bees, how AI is accelerating Bible translation. I've talked to folks from SIL and Wycliffe and others, and they're telling me they're making huge strides based on some of these technologies. Right? AI reducing traffic accidents, increasing crop yields, and drug discovery, all kinds of wonderful things. These are ways of using AI, showing love for neighbor, serving God, answering a call to look after the earth and its creatures. These are things we should be doing. But of course, this structure direction thing, AI can also be misdirected. right? We see how chatbots are hallucinating and just spewing nonsense at times, how generative AI is being used to spread misinformation and disinformation, how AI deep fakes, right, how they can make videos and movies of things that aren't real, can be used to spread lies and manipulate the truth, to spread propaganda. Eric Horvitz, who is a chief scientific officer at Microsoft, once wrote, "Our children and our grandchildren could find themselves in a post-Christian or post-epistemic world where it's difficult or impossible to distinguish fact from fiction." You can't believe what you see anymore. You can't believe what you read anymore. And we're being manipulated in lots of ways. And so I think that's harnessing AI towards things that are misdirected and perverted and distorted in some ways. I think an even more pernicious thing is the concept of latent persuasion. So some research recently has been showing that if we continually use AI, chatbots, and so on, that they can actually subtly change our views about things, right? If you've got a little chatbot that's suggesting how you ought to complete your sentences and how you got to complete your text messages and how you ought to complete your email, over time, right? It's like having a little Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder saying, "Well, why just end the sentence this way?" Over time, people have actually measured. Social scientists have found that it actually changes the way we think. I think we're more susceptible to that, even Christians, to being manipulated. And I mean, this is already the case with the news media and with other things. We're manipulated, and we see the world in ways that are shaped by propaganda, and it changes the way we think. And we ought to be concerned about that. People who believe in the truth and people who believe in being shaped by the biblical story rather than some other story about the world. AI can be misdirected towards injustice, right? The book on the left there, Weapons of Math Destruction, is one of the first books about data science and some of its issues, written by Kathy O'Neill, pioneer in the world of data science. And she talks about how the bias, that is sort of implicit in a lot of the data sets out there, is now affecting how machine learning systems make decisions. And if you think about it, algorithms are determining who gets a job, who gets a loan, who gets parole from prison, all of these sorts of things. And these biases are kind of baked into the system and can create a kind of injustice that can be usually used to harm more vulnerable populations. Here's a few other little items that I've put on the slide as well. There was a system that was used to predict future criminal activity, and they determined it was biased against African Americans. Another book, Automating Inequality, looks at some of the issues about how these algorithms are actually, biased against the poor and the weak. Amazon even had a recruiting algorithm that it was using to hire people to wade through all the job applications, and it was biased against women. And so this issue of justice, right? It was one of the norms we talked about. Justice is important. We have to be careful how we deploy AI. And I think another inappropriate use of AI is trying to build machines that pretend to be people. So here's a little article. I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but it's basically an article called Reverend Robot, Automating the Clergy, right? And it says basically, if we were to get a chatbot to replace a pastor, this chatbot would be unfailingly attentive and patient. It would remember the details of every interaction. It would pick up on subtle cues that a human would miss. The cost of educating a new chatbot would be way cheaper than sending someone to Calvin Seminary. Each generation would perform better than the past, right? And basically, it's an argument for, maybe we should just automate the clergy. I don't know what Peter Juncker thinks of that, but I think that's a problem. Of course, there's a lot of companies now trying to sell us systems to tutor our kids. Right? Con Amigo is one example, but they pretend to be little people that sort of, talk and interact with your children, help them through their schoolwork. There's even technology now that lets you speak to your dead relatives by simulating them, right? So you take all the data from your dead relative, their text messages, their letters, their emails, you train an AI system. You can even train it on the voice in your dead. You can have the system call you up in the voice of your dead relative, and you can continue to speak with them. That's a little creepy. I wrote an article about this if you're interested. If you Google artificial intelligence and grief and my name, you'll probably find it. I lost my wife a year and a half ago, and I know grief is not something you can go around, that you can go over or under. It's something you have to go through. And if you don't, it comes out sideways in other ways. That this is not healthy. And of course, there's all kinds of companies that are, offering you AI girlfriends, and you can tune them to be exactly what you want them to be. And there's even a CEO of one of these companies who says, it'll probably be okay if we end up marrying, right, a chatbot in time. And in fact, a recent survey showed that one of the biggest uses of chatbots is actually companionship. And I think the problem with this, some people ask me, well, what's wrong with that? There's some people that are lonely. I think a relationship with a chatbot is a relationship of one person. And it's all about you. And it actually damages you for real human connection, which is often messy. It takes work. But it's far more fulfilling. We're created to be in community. I wrote a bit about this. If you're interested, you could find it if you Google it. The Problem with Chatbot Personas is the name of the article. There's even an AI Jesus. Don't go looking it up, but someone's trained an AI system to mimic Jesus. The one redeeming application of this is this one. Someone made a system called an AI granny that just sits there and outwits scammers on the phone. So scammers call, and this AI chatbot just keeps them on the phone by asking silly questions and mires them down. That may be a redeeming application of this particular technology. But what about the church? I don't know whether AI is being used at LaGrave, but there are all kinds of companies that are rallying now to offer you AI services for the church. You can find online a prayer generator, right? You can sort of click the occasion that you want it for, the length, and so on. There's a sermon generator. I trust, Reverend Yunker's not using one of those, right? There's Sermon Pal, right? The Sermon Pal in the middle. Let me read what this advertisement says. It says, discover the power of AI to ethically craft your sermons in a fraction of the time while being inspired by the Holy Spirit. That's quite a advertising claim. I think we need to be careful of these kinds of companies that some of them are run by, conscientious Christian folk who want to help the church, but I think we have to be careful, how we appropriately use AI in the church and kind of understand its limitations, understand its shortcomings, understand our responsibility, what it means to live in community. I think there's a lot of big questions here. So here's some examples of how AI might be appropriate in a church setting, right? Using ChatGPT to suggest worship songs based on themes and topics. One of my colleagues at Calvin in the computer science department runs hymnary.org, where he actually uses AI to help with search, to help people find hymns and songs. Provide closed captions for meetings. Now, this isn't foolproof. You can get poor translations and poor closed captioning, but it could provide accessibility where other options are not possible. Smart meeting schedulers to find out when people are all available and automate that. Streamlining certain administrative tasks. Generating graphics. Now there's ethical issues there with copyright and so on, but perhaps there's a way to use that. Assisting in Bible translation, which I mentioned already, is a wonderful use. And then sermon and education research. So not turning to ChatGPT or a large language model to actually generate a sermon or to produce educational material, but using it the way you'd use a Bible concordance or a commentary, right, in the hands of someone who's theologically trained and wise. It can be a great possible research tool. Now, I've even played around with this a bit. I built a Heidelberg Catechism bot. And I've got a QR code up there in case you want to talk to this bot. But basically, it's trained on the Heidelberg Catechism, and it will answer questions. But of course, all AI systems will hallucinate, will sometimes go off into the weeds, and so your mileage will vary. But sometimes there's some neat insights. So I actually asked this bot, I said, what does the Catechism have to say about artificial intelligence? And I don't have a lot of time, but I'll give you sort of the short take on this. The Heidelberg Catechism does not directly address the concept of AI, as it is a modern development. However, principles from the Catechism can be applied. First of all, human responsibility and stewardship, question and answer 6, right? Ethics and love for neighbor, which is in question and answer 4. Trust in God, question and answer 94, 95, right? Moral accountability, question and answer 91. You can see how, a system like this, working alongside a wise, person could actually help assist with research and finding ways to apply confessions or theological writings to academic work or to help with preaching. I just want to close with this. I wrote an article a little while ago titled, "The Problem with AI is Deeper Than You Think." I've listed all kinds of issues with AI, right? Justice issues and issues with truth and issues with making systems that look like people. But I think the problem is actually a layer deeper than that, right? And I think of the words of Proverbs 4, verse 23, right? Above all else, guard your hearts because everything you do flows from it. Even our technical work, our computing work, it all comes from the heart. And it depends on where that heart is pointed. And I think that, the phrase at the beginning here, above all else, sort of shows how this is of strategic importance, right? We need to safeguard our hearts. And the way that we do that is probably recovering some ancient practices, things like Sabbath and devotions and service and solitude and putting our screens away at times, shaping ourselves in the biblical story, which is part of what worship is about as well. I think that this is something that we need to be even more attentive to, right? This idea of latent persuasion, how our beliefs can be shaped by all of these systems that are surrounding us, needs an antidote. And I think part of that is immersing ourselves daily, weekly in the biblical story. One of my colleagues at Calvin, Jamie Smith, once wrote, "Being a disciple of Jesus is not primarily a matter of getting the right ideas and doctrines in your head," although that's important too, I would add. "Rather, it's a matter of being the kind of person who loves rightly." And of course, this is something that's part of Christian education. It's not only training someone in facts and to be competent, but also shaping in them to be a kind of person. That's the job of the church too, to disciple people to become more like Jesus. And so I think in an age of AI, some of that stuff is going to become more important than ever. And finally, I have a little, I'll close and then we have time for some questions. I have a little advertisement. At Calvin University, we're going to be holding a Wisdom in the Age of AI conference, October 8 to 10, 2026, so 1 year from now, but you can mark it on your calendars if you want. We have keynote speakers Andy Crouch, Rosalind Picard, who's a Christian machine learning expert at MIT, and then we have Paolo Benanti, who's actually the Pope's AI guy. He's in the Vatican, he's advising the Pope, who actually is quite concerned about AI and about justice related to that, and he'll be coming as well to share his insights. And so we'll also have a track that's run by the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship, where we'll be exploring AI in the church, AI in worship in more depth. So keep that in mind. My hope is that one day at Calvin we'll be able to set up a center for faith and technology. This has been my dream for a number of years, where we can help equip the church and Christians to kind of answer the questions of our modern age, especially with things like AI, to think Christianly about this, to join the public square in the dialogue about how we ought to use these sorts of things. That's something that remains a dream of mine, and I hope that may come true one day. But I think there's a need for Christians to join this dialogue, not just speaking internally, but also being salt and light. I tell my students, some of them end up at Google and Microsoft and Facebook. I say, you're going to be like Daniels in Babylon, like you're going off into these secular areas that are animated by a very different worldview story, and you need to find a way to be faithful in those contexts. And so I'll end it there, and then maybe we could have a bit of time for questions before we need to leave for the next service. So thank you very much. Yeah.
And the response to chat from chat has been, oh, we're working on this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another persona, the individual who was the guru that killed the healthcare executive. A girl was on TV said, I'm married to this chat AI person.
Yeah. Yeah. These chatbots are very charming. And there's been some recent articles about how people just get pulled down the garden path further and further and ending up with a kind of psychosis almost that's caused by, interacting with these things. And the issue is that they're designed to be engaging, right? I mean, whenever you use a free product, you're the product, right? They're basically selling your eyeballs and your time and your data, right? They're using your data. And so I think some of these companies need to take more responsibility for this. And I think these court cases are kind of showing some of these really sad sort of consequences. And I think this is part of the conversation. I think there's been this huge race to try, each company sees there's been hundreds of billions of dollars spent in this sector. And everyone's trying to get ahead of the other. And they're not thinking about responsible ways of unfolding these things, but just the first one to get the next incremental performance and to get business, basically. So I think one of the things that we need to think about also is regulations. I know not everyone's happy with that. We have regulations for cars, for the drug industry, for the aviation. These tools have, and not just in terms of interacting with people, but these tools actually have profound possibilities for consequences in other areas too. And so I think having some kind of safeguards, some kind of responsibility that these companies have to take is part of how we need to be thinking about this. And I think this is how Christians can actually join the public square and join the dialogue. I think that this is going to be part of how we can be a faithful witness. I didn't include this slide, but I'll throw it up. There are organizations like Partnership on AI to Benefit People, AI for Good. I'm part of an organization, I'm an advisor for AI and Faith, which is actually a interfaith organization. So there's Muslims and Jews and Christians and other trying to work together to think about how can we think about the public good. And I see this as kind of working out of a principle that folks like Abraham Kuyper articulated a long time ago, this notion of principled pluralism, that we need to encourage respect and dialogue in the public sphere among those of differing beliefs to forge partnerships towards the common good. And I say to my students going off to Silicon Valley, that's part of your job too, and to be a winsome witness, to give an account of your faith if you're asked, but also to kind of nudge things towards the public good, towards shalom. And I think there's an opportunity to join this dialogue. Another reason why I think a center for faith and technology might be helpful, a more deliberate sort of institution that's joining those conversations that are shaping technology in the nation and around the world. So, yeah. And any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
So I would hold strongly this property that says it is an honor to overlook an offense. I think it seems like a very human ideal. It requires forgiveness and forgetting. But I understand that that is not one of the qualities of AI. Can you compare that? How would an AI structure? I mean, I've heard that AI doesn't admit it's wrong. I don't know if that's true, but isn't it very important to forget? And can't AI forget?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at below the, one layer below that is the distinction between a person and a machine. I mean, an AI really has no understanding of what it's even talking about. I mean, under the hood, an AI system is putting a statistically probable next word at the end of a trail of tokens and then just snapping them together. And it has no context, it has no understanding, it has no, there's no one home. It's not a person. So even the question of of forgiveness and so on, which I think is something that we're uniquely called to do as people. I mean, you could even think about, should animals, offer forgiveness? Like I think people are unique. We're distinct from animals, we're distinct from machines, we have a distinct responsibility and freedom. We have freedom and responsibility, which machines don't have. A machine responds, a machine's very predictable in its response. ChatGPT has what's called a stochastic element, so it uses some randomness, but in terms of picking between a range of possible next words, so you'll see differences in responses, but under the hood it's just executing algorithms. And I like to tell my students, every AI system could actually be built with gears and pulleys and camshafts. I mean, under the hood, it's just, and those things don't have there's no person there. There's no awareness. There's no understanding. There's no. It's a different kind of thing. So I think one of the questions that we need to ask before we use AI for something, we need to answer the question, what is it, right? And once we answer like, what is it, then we can say, well, then what is an appropriate way to use it, right? If it's not a person, if it doesn't have a soul, then we ought not to use it in relationships. We ought not to use it in